Good evening, everyone. It is 7:30 on Monday, 29th of April. I'd like to welcome you to the SHP Understanding LGBTQ plus Resources showcase. Tonight, we're going to have two presentations, one from Professor Bob Mills from UCL, and the second presentation will be from myself. We're just going to give people a few minutes to join the show. So I'm going to go off screen and there will be the holding page will be up for a few minutes and then we'll start our presentation shortly. Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I have great pleasure to introduce tonight Professor Bob Mills, who is the Head of History of Art at UCL in London. And we had the enormous privilege to have a fantastic workshop with Bob a few weeks ago at the British Library as part of our Schools History Project Understanding event. And I'm hoping there's a few people here tonight who would have been at that event and may be able to kind of share some of their comments in the chat box on the right hand side, which you are free to use to answer ask any questions that you have. And Bob will take those questions at the end of his session in about 30 minutes time or so. After that, I'm going to talk through the resources that I've been producing on LGBTQ plus histories, and we'll wrap up at around about 8:30. So without further ado, I'm going to take myself off the screen. I'm going to pass over to Bob, who's going to introduce himself. I'm going to disappear, and then we'll get ready to go. So over to you, Bob.
Okay, thanks very much, Dan. I'm just going to start sharing my slides. Great. Okay, that seems to be working. Thanks very much, Dan. So my name is Bob Mills. As Dan said, I'm based in the History of Art department at UCL. Very happy to be participating in this event and introducing some resources connected to a project that I've been leading with a colleague in UCL's history department, Dr. Rebecca Jennings, over the past 18 months, which it was called Supporting LGBT plus and Queer Histories in Secondary Schools. Just to say a little bit briefly about the project itself before I move into talking about some of the resources we developed. A key outcome of this project, which was supported by knowledge exchange funding through UCL's Higher Education Innovation Fund allocation. It was developed, it was the key outcome was to develop a small collection of teaching packs in partnership with school teachers and other academics. Above all, our goal was to create some freely available and crucially flexible resources that could be used in a very practical way in the classroom, crucially resources that could be adapted to the sometimes very, very different contexts in which LGBT and queer histories are generally being introduced within the school curriculum. So lots of room for flex, lots of room for teachers to make of the resources what they will. So I will introduce some of the resources themselves in a moment, but just a little bit more first about context for the project. So I've just put up here what I think were our two main aims in this project. The first was to facilitate the integration of queer and LGBT topics into the secondary school curriculum. And we focused on secondary schools because, I mean, originally we had ambitious idea about trying to think across the school curriculum from primary school through to secondary school, but we felt we really needed to focus in the initial phase of the project on secondary schools, and more particularly on key stage 3 and 4. So to integrate LGBT and queer histories into that part of the curriculum, but in so doing also to make schools feel more inclusive for young people and also for teachers who identify as LGBT or want to express allyship. And our second big aim for this project was to build bridges between academic historians such as myself and Rebecca, whose research and teaching is centrally concerned with questions of gender and sexuality in different time periods and different contexts, with queer and LGBT related topics. And I'll say a little bit more about my own interests in a moment, but basically I'm a medievalist who's thinking about these questions primarily through the prism of medieval examples. So to build bridges between academic historians such as myself and teachers working in schools across the UK who are themselves experts in particular areas of history, but also in the school curriculum, teachers who know firsthand what the possibilities and challenges are of introducing these themes within the classroom. Um, I'll just bring up some of the other aims of the project that come under that, those two sort of basic objectives. Um, I won't go through all of these in detail, but just to say that one of our other objectives was simply to listen to teachers and to work with them to identify specific challenges and support needs. We also really wanted to find ways to enable teachers to integrate teaching on these topics across the school year in connection, particularly with aspects of the existing curriculum. So trying to find ways to as we put it, usualize queer histories. So rather than seeing particular intervals or times of year, LGBT plus History Month or Pride Month, for example, as a focal point for introducing these histories, which has obviously been very effective in the last 10, 20 years. But we also wanted to find a way to really think about how queer history is part of the very practice of history, as we think about it as a field, as a discipline. Um, Rebecca and I also wanted to find a way to initiate a dialogue within schools on perhaps some of the more challenging dimensions of queer history as a method, um, driven, by a sensitivity to the complexity and the fluidity of words and concepts for describing sexual and gender diversity over time. Something which has been very important to academic historians has been to think about those nuances, those moments when some of our vocabularies and ways of thinking don't quite work in relation to the past, and sometimes the quite recent past, and sometimes, as is the case with my own work, the more distant past. Um, the body of critical writing that's sometimes referred to as queer theory, it does have a bit of a reputation, perhaps unjustified, but a reputation for being difficult, perhaps even somewhat arcane, inaccessible to the sort of general reader, as it were. And so Rebecca and I were keen to make such arguments accessible beyond the narrow confines of academia, while at the same time not simply dumbing down. Finally, we wanted to make accessible a wide range of source materials. So the sources that we put together, which are the basis for the teaching packs that we've devised, include materials like oral histories, which are a very important but somewhat untapped resource, particularly for thinking about modern and contemporary histories. um, Media like films, music, visual images. And I said at the beginning, I'm based in the art history department at UCL. While my research is very interdisciplinary, art and visual culture plays a particular role in my own research. So I was particularly keen to show how an image isn't just an illustration of things that we might find in text, but the images crucially have a role to play in shaping our ideas about gender and sexuality, both in the past and today. And these kinds of sources, films, music, oral histories, visual images, material culture, they not only enliven the practice of teaching itself, engaging students with the materials, but have also proved really, really important to the development of queer history as a practice, which often necessarily entails expanding our horizons well beyond the documentary sources, the written materials that have traditionally been seen as the kind of bedrock of history with a capital H. So in 2023, with a view to fulfilling these objectives, Rebecca and I held a series of workshops, first with teachers alone, second workshop with academic specialists in the field of queer and LGBT histories, and a third workshop that brought those two groups together into the same room, to join together to discuss some worked examples that Rebecca and I had devised. And then last summer, we used those discussions as the basis for developing 3 case studies, which I'll be introducing this evening, which form the basis for the teaching packs that we launched last year. So, I mean, I'm not going to go into the details of this particular slide, which just suggests the format for the project. And here is, as an index of the lively discussions that we had during the workshop phase of the project, is a snapshot from our first workshop at Friends House in central London just over a year ago now. And here is a summary of the project's main outcomes, which includes a link to the teacher packs that we've made freely available via the project web page. And I'm just going to see whether I can now paste the link to that webpage into the chat. Okay, it looks like I can't do that at the moment, so I will try again a little bit later. So before introducing the teaching packs in more detail, I just wanted to also quickly take the opportunity now to acknowledge the input of several people who played an especially important role in advising and helping shape the resources that we eventually developed. So a small group of teachers, Becky Knowles, Neve Hogan, Glenn Foster and John Marrell, sat on a focus group last summer to provide some detailed feedback on each of the 3 case studies that we ended up developing. For one of them, we also had the input from an academic historian, Craig Griffiths, who's based at Manchester Metropolitan University. And that was particularly because of Craig's expertise in themes associated with one of our case studies, which I'll briefly talk to towards the end of my presentation this evening. Administration for the project was undertaken by a UCL PhD student, Bailey Woodley, and we also benefited from the insights of Claire Hollis, who, as well as being a teacher herself, is currently completing a PhD in a related topic at UCL's Institute of Education, as well as Claire's supervisor, Professor Arthur Chapman, whose expertise in Holocaust education proved especially helpful to our own thinking here. So I'm going to now move to talk about the first of the teacher packs. And before I do so, I'll say most about this first case study, this first teacher pack, because it's the one that I had most of a hand in producing, and it relates quite directly to my own field of expertise as a medievalist. My books include the one on the left there, which I co-authored with Matt Cook, who was the lead author, Randolph Trumbach and Harry Cox. And I wrote the medieval section for this book, A Gay History of Britain, which was published in 2007. And I also authored another book, which came out in 2015, called Seeing Sodomy in the Middle Ages, which basically is a book that considers how a category invented by medieval churchmen, which we still hear used today, both in pejorative contexts, but also sometimes in legal contexts, sodomy, how this category was mobilized in art and literature of the period that we call the Middle Ages, sometimes being mobilized and visualized in ways that challenge the stereotype of the Middle Ages as a predominantly repressive, queer denying era. So I do also think about some of the positive ways in which ideas around gender diversity, sexual diversity emerge in this period and enter the field of vision. So that's the basis on which I developed this particular teaching pack. So just to explain the basic format of the teaching packs that we devised, each involves a case study which is built around an inquiry question. Now, just to say here that Rebecca and I are no experts when it comes to inquiry questions or how best to devise them. This was one of the things we learned a great deal about from the teachers who participated in our workshops. But the question that I came up with as a focus for this particular teaching pack was how different were medieval ideas of love and relationships from our own. So the teaching packs include at the start, and these take the sort of form of lesson plans. There's a brief overview, a summary of some objectives, and then the teaching packs move through a series of activities and also context building sections that enable students over the course of 1 or 2 lessons to develop an answer to that main question. And then underpinning each of the case studies is a collection of sources, which, as I said earlier, they range across media. So here, for example, the first source that students will encounter is a tomb slab. It's a relief on stone, which was placed over the grave of 2 English knights who died a few days apart in a place not far from Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, um, in the late 14th century, so round about the time of Geoffrey Chaucer. And this image on the grave, it appears to demonstrate the pair's loving relationship. And this particular source is also accompanied by another, which is a very short extract from a chronicle from the same time, which also makes a passing reference to those same nights, to their deaths, and to their strong feelings for one another. So this inquiry starts by getting students to think about what is at stake in these sources, how the relationship between two men is described, the kinds of language, the kinds of attitude that are displayed in this context, and perhaps, again, challenging some of the stereotypes of the Middle Ages as only being repressive when it comes to different ideas of love and desire. Crucially, while we introduced formatting to make the resources visually appealing, as well as being potentially shareable in class in the form of handouts or PDFs, directly with students, we were also keen to make the resources fully adaptable. So here I'm showing how we also have made these resources in the teaching packs available as fully editable Word document versions. So basically teachers can do what they like with them, transform them into other formats, edit, add stuff, take stuff out as they see fit. As you can see, in many cases, we've also glossed unfamiliar vocabulary. So just at the bottom of the source B, there's a few notes on particular language, words like inconsolable or gentleman of metal or illustrious, just giving a bit more context there and perhaps helping students of different abilities with some of the language issues, and also just some ideas that might be a little bit strange or alien. Um, and then generally, really we've just provided as much as possible to help guide discussion on various topics we identified as being potentially valuable to introduce these themes into the curriculum. In addition, each case study is supported by slides. So I'm showing an example from the first slide in this particular teaching pack. These again can be used directly in the classroom, or again, they can be adapted to teachers and schools' own specific needs. So also we became aware in the workshops that some schools insist on branding their teaching materials or disseminating them in specific formats, adding logos and so forth. So these resources are freely adaptable, so you can basically again do what you want with them. So as I say, this is an example of the introductory side for this particular inquiry question. And then I'll just show an example of how a particular source appears in the slides. So there's our grave slab again in one of the slides. And additional teaching aids include presenter notes. So here just showing the presenter view. The presenter notes will allow a teacher to introduce some of the wider context surrounding the interpretation of a given source. So there's just extra information. We've given as much as possible. Obviously, teachers can make of this material what they want. And we've also included alongside the sources and some suggestions about activities, even some indications of timings. We've also included in this particular pack some additional materials. So sorry, just to say this is showing how, in the context of one of the activities, the students can start to think about the sources side by side, the questions are brought up on screen to open up some discussion. But there's also a little reassuring note on the slide just saying that there's not necessarily a right answer to these questions, and just really trying to keep the discussion as open as possible. So yeah, as I said, there's also this section which has been included in this teaching pack, which I've called In Focus, which has some additional contextual material and related slides that can be used to guide general discussion of specific sources and to build up relevant context. Um, and then in the workshops that we held with teachers, it was also apparent that they would value summaries of key trends and debates in academic scholarship. Um, Now that's partly because, so I'm just showing some of the more of the in focus materials here, slides, um, talking about heraldry, for example, as a way of helping students to interpret that tomb slab I discussed earlier. Um, but yes, in the workshops, teachers said that they'd value some summaries of historiography, key debates, and trends in academic scholarship. And that's partly because we know that teachers are very time poor, that you don't have much time for preparation, partly because teachers don't have access to the range of published scholarships that academics have access to. Because for academics, research is part of their jobs. Universities give them access to these platforms, which are managed by publishers who often have a paywall for those who aren't subscribers. And so we're aware that we have access to lots of research materials that teachers don't. So in the medieval case study that I developed, I also created a teacher extras section summarizing the current state of the field regarding topics such as same-sex intimacy and gender diversity in the Middle Ages, as well as providing a further reading list for any teachers who wish to follow up on any of the issues raised. Here, for example, is a detail from the account that I give of the debates and scholarly responses concerning a key document in the history of transgender experience in medieval England. This is a record of the interrogation of what in today's terms might be viewed as a trans woman in 14th century London, who was arrested by the city authorities at the time for the crime of committing a sinful sex act. And so this is just summarizing some of the key scholars who have um, introduced this particular source and interpreted its significance. So we felt that this would also be helpful material for some teachers, just so they feel they're aware of what's going on in the field of academic histories, just to provide a bit of context, just because that might help nuance and enrich the discussions with students. So now, very briefly, I will introduce the two other case studies which my colleague Rebecca took the lead in developing. And these each take a slightly different format. So the second teacher pack we developed focuses on the question, what did freedom mean for people in the 60s? This particular inquiry question format is really trying to encourage students to look at a different, comparatively at different social groups and perspectives relating to this broad central question. And so what we did in order to enable that discussion and comparative analysis across different social groups was to come up with a series of lessons. We came up with 6 different lessons in this case. And one of these lessons, a class on homosexuality, law reform, and daily life, considers within that broad question around freedom in the 60s, considers the impact of debates around homosexuality in Britain in the 1960s. Homosexuality between men is legalized in 1967. And so this is a particularly important moment. And so we're thinking about what's going on in the broader context of the 60s that perhaps is, um, you know, an important backdrop to that particular development. And this sort of format where we're integrating queer LGBT histories into a larger set of issues and questions is really designed to demonstrate how LGBT and queer histories can be integrated into a broader set of issues and themes rather than being introduced simply in a standalone way. So that goes back to that sort of usualizing principle that I mentioned earlier. And again, as with the medieval case study, the resources we developed here include a set of lesson plans and slides, complete with suggested activities. And also we've incorporated reproductions of extracts from relevant sources. And in this particular teaching pack, as well as including extracts from things like newspaper articles and autobiographies. And what we've done also in the teacher packs and in the slides is to actually reproduce not just the text, but also showing visual representations of things like newspaper articles, so the students are encountering them in their original media. Also, we've included extracts from diaries, letters, and again, we've sometimes been able to reproduce the letter as it was sent. And this source pack also includes extracts from interviews based on oral history recordings, some of which are also available to listen to as well. So to sort of really enliven students' understanding of those sources and give them a sense of some real voices from the past. So here's just an example of the kind of context building slide that we included in that particular source pack. And then finally, the third teacher pack asks, what might resistance look like in Nazi Germany? So this is the third of the case studies. Again, this is one that Rebecca had more of a hand in than me, but this is also the teacher pack that our colleague at Manchester Met, Craig Griffiths, also gave us some help and advice with, for which we're very thankful because this relates particularly to some of his areas of expertise. And this, the selection of this particular case study came out of the fact that we're very aware that the Weimar Republic, Nazi Germany, and events surrounding the Second World War are all key parts of the curriculum in many schools, and that this would therefore be an ideal opportunity to introduce themes concerning the treatment of gender and sexual minorities that are fundamentally connected, again, to issues faced by other social groups, other persecuted groups in that particular context. Um, this particular inquiry also introduces questions of change, even over a relatively short period of time. So, what happens between the Weimar Republic and Nazi um, Germany in terms of social attitudes, and really thinks about how those changes impacted the lives of sometimes very different groups of people. Um, this inquiry also takes up the question of why some people resisted Nazi oppression and others did not. But again, thinking about how that idea of resistance might link with other forms of resistance, political activism, some of which might also be related to later struggles for LGBT rights, for example. So we included, for example, as in one of the sources, an interview with a German pharmacist called Karl, who served in the German army during World War II, was also a gay man. Um, and the other thing to say about this particular teacher pack was that it was designed also to take students outside of the British Isles. We obviously, are still very much in the three case studies we developed here, focusing on Britain and Europe. And the idea is that what we want to do is um, test these resources out, see them going out into the classroom and get some feedback, crucially, with a view to um, potentially scaling up the project from the pilot stage that we're at the moment into something a little bit bigger. So as I say, all of the resources I mentioned are freely available to download from our project webpage, which is hosted by UCL, and Dan has very kindly put the link to that webpage in the chat. And also, if you do end up using any of these resources in your own teaching, would be really thrilled if you could pass on any feedback about how it all went. So there's a short form which is linked to that webpage, which you can use to record any comments, but you're also welcome simply to drop Rebecca or myself a line by email if that's easier. And you can find our email addresses on UCL web pages pretty easily. And we really would like to hear from any teachers who are testing out these resources or even considering using them at a future date, just to get a sense of how they're being taken up and received. It's worth noting in this context that the teacher packs we developed As I say, this is potentially just a first phase. We're actively considering scaling the project up at a later stage to develop resources related to a much broader set of histories and contexts. So as such, any feedback that we receive in this pilot phase of our project will be received very warmly. Um, I'm just going to now open up to any questions that we might have.
Okay, I'm just going to join you here, Bob, just for a second. There is a slight delay on the transmission from where we're going out. So it's about a minute or so. So we're just going to give people a little bit of time. But firstly, can I just thank you so much for sharing those resources? I think what's particularly pertinent is the way in which you've managed to kind of embed it throughout the curriculum. That's so important, rather than having it as a kind of bolt on, as you say, in LGBT plus month, or just tagged on somewhere, rather than actually kind of flowing all the way through the curriculum or so. And I think particularly, that last set of resources which you referenced around Weimar and Nazi Germany, that is the vast majority of schools across the UK are still teaching that course. And so, yes, it may not be on the GCSE specification yet. And I think that's potentially somewhere in the future which we'll be wanting to encourage the exam boards to pursue. But it certainly is going to enrich students' understanding of that course. And of course, students are able to embed anything from their own knowledge into the answers to those questions. So they would certainly score very highly on any questions around kind of the Weimar culture, the kind of repression under the Nazi regime, and so on. So it's, going to be very relevant for a lot of the work that they're doing.
Yeah, no, well, that's really encouraging to know. And yeah, it seems like it's a sort of win-win to be able to include these kinds of histories within the curriculum as it currently is being taught, in fact.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, I think really by now schools should be way beyond the kind of token representation, whether it's to do with gender and sexuality, whether it's to do with race and ethnicity, and so on. These really need to be kind of integrated throughout the kind of full curriculum, because, as you said right at the beginning, this history is very much part of a universal experience and part of our experience, and this should be utilized. It should not be kind of seen as different from kind of mainstream history that's being taught within the schools. I'm just going to have a quick look and see if we have anyone who's popped anything into the chat. We do have our first question, which come in from Lucy Bullock, and Lucy's asking whether you've hoped to develop any resources for Key Stage 5 students in the future.
Yeah, no, thanks for your question, Lucy. Absolutely. I mean, we're very aware that there's loads of potential for integrating these histories at Key Stage 5, particularly when it comes to things like, and I forgive me if I'm getting the wrong terminology here, but sort of individual studies and things like that, sort of mini dissertations. I'm not sure what the language that's used for A level is, and maybe it varies to different examples. But as I understand it, there's still a possibility of developing sort of individual sort of projects, research projects of various kinds, and we, Rebecca and I certainly think there's lots of potential to give some sort of general guidance to teachers on how to both stimulate those kind of projects, but also support them. So perhaps, giving ideas about sort of reading lists, or particular books that might explain a sort of queer methodology or approach to history, or just give some sort of working examples of how to take those kind of approaches to particular sources, and perhaps, focusing on particular periods. So that seems to be a particular area where, it would be quite easy, in fact, to start supporting schools in the delivery of teaching. But Dan, perhaps you can sort of correct me on the lingo.
I think
Or indeed whether I'm fantasizing something that's no longer there. I mean, I remember I had very happy time writing what was called an individual study. This was back in the late 80s, and when I was doing my A-level history, and I did my individual study on Anne Boleyn and Anne Boleyn's downfall in the Tudor court. And um, it was actually what got me started in thinking about queer history, because and I mentioned my book on sodomy, but sodomy was an allegation that was running around the Tudor court at the time, and was, according to one historian, perhaps contributed perceptions about gender and sexuality, and goings on in the Tudor court contributed to Anne Boleyn's downfall. So I was, reading up on sodomy and the Buggery Act in the 1530s, back when I was doing my A levels, even before I came out. And that was really meaningful to me. So yes, my memory of was that even though it wasn't being taught, that I was able to really start thinking through themes which have kind of stayed with me ever since, in my school days. So I'm hoping there are still those opportunities.
Yeah, I mean, certainly Claire Hollis would be able to talk quite a lot about the work that she's doing. She's the head of history in the sixth form down in Reigate College. And I know that she's done a lot of work in kind of integrating queer histories into some of the courses that she teaches. I think in particular, there's some kind of, I think, as you mentioned, Bob, Tudor history, A-level Elizabethan histories, which she's been focusing on. But there was also, I think it's now called the Extended Project, which is kind of similar to
Thank you.
what you were talking about. And of course, there's again, just like yourself, you have the flexibility and the freedom to be innovative in the choice of your project. So there is certainly opportunities available at Key Stage 5, but I'll happily share. Actually, I think when the resources went out with the link for this project, Claire's materials were mentioned up on that. And again, if you contact me or Bob, we're very happy to kind of put you in touch with her. Okay, Bob, I think we're going to wrap it up from you for the moment. And I'm going to just kind of take us through for the last 15 minutes on some of the Key Stage 3 materials. Thank you so much. And then if you stick around, maybe we'll come back at the end just to finish off. But I'll take you off the stage now. Thank you. All right, thank you, everyone. We've got about 15 minutes or so for me just to showcase some of the materials that I've been working on. I'm just going to take that banner off the screen so we can have questions at the end. And the work that I've been doing, which is going to come up on stage now, is focused around this inquiry question which we give to our Year 9 students. And the question is, pop culture, protest or parliament, which has done more to change the position of the LGBTQ plus communities in Britain? So when I originally constructed the course, I was playing around with ways of disrupting the narrative. And I originally thought about opening up the course from contemporary times, so set right in kind of the students' contemporary context, and then tracking back to the time when homosexuality was illegal. And having now taught this now for 2 years, I'm subsequently going to revise these resources, and I think we're probably going to go back to a more conventional chronological approach to the unit, because I think we found that it didn't quite have the impact that I was hoping for the students in terms of understanding and recognizing the struggle that these communities have been engaged in for certainly hundreds of years, but in this case, we were focusing on from the kind of 1930s onwards. So I'm going to just kind of take you through a few of the materials that we were working on, similar to the way Bob talked about at the beginning, how important it is to set a context and front load some of the thinking behind the course with the students. And so we wanted to really be very, very clear to the students why they're studying LGBTQ plus histories. It's very much part of the mainstream in our school, and it's but at the same time, we recognise it's a history that's been silenced, and that we want those voices to be heard. So explaining to the students very clearly why we're doing this, but also because some of the students may not have come across these histories before, just being very clear about the importance of a safe space in the classroom. And I have to say, in the 3 years that I've been teaching this course, I have not had a single episode of homophobic, transphobic, biphobic language within the classroom. We have had, in some ways, students voicing their opinions, maybe through some disengagement in the lesson. But by the time the course has been finished, that change, you can see a change in the kind of engagement and the contributions within the lessons. And as we've utilized this history, it's just become very much part of their every kind of lesson experience. And so students have kind of moved on from what may have been uncomfortable for some of them, for whatever reasons, into a place where we're having very typical kind of classroom conversations and experiences. So the way in which the outcome for our lessons was constructed was, again, having kind of thought very carefully about the way in which we are constructing our curriculum through a decolonial lens. We wanted students to construct their own digital archive to answer this question. And we're doing that for a number of reasons. One, because we want them to understand the power of the archive and the way in which the archive has been responsible for silencing different communities, and as a way of empowering the students to be able to kind of navigate through these questions and through the archive experience, so that they are able to kind of engage with these lessons on their terms, and thinking about the way in which we can kind of bring some of these previously silenced or marginalized histories into a very kind of live experience for them. So that's driving the inquiry, is this kind of final outcome around constructing their own digital archive. And certainly this year has been very, very successful in the way the students have engaged with that. And I'll share a couple of examples at the end very quickly. Those icons on the right are also very important, because clearly those three elements flow through all of the lessons, okay, and constantly referred to, and just kind of bringing them back to that EQ around what has changed the position of these communities. And again, trying to kind of establish that this is not a linear kind of progression, that there's lots of kind of bumps in the road along the way. So that kind of gives you a sense of the overview of the individual, or actually the kind of individual inquiry questions that we pose and take the students through. As I said, we've started typically with the most recent examples in terms of Same-Sex Marriage Act. We look at the Gender Recognition Act, which was in 2004, and then we start to kind of move back into the 1980s with Clause 28, later Section 28. We look at the impact of the HIV and AIDS virus in the 1980s. Actually, there's a lot on the 1980s because we also focus on the role of the lesbian and gays supporting minors in the mid 1980s as well, and the way and that had an impact later on for the Labour Party supporting moves towards same-sex marriage. And then we've kind of tracked back through to the kind of 1960s and 70s, looking at some of the popular cultural elements in those days with people like David Bowie as kind of very pioneering icon. And then we look at kind of the years before 67 in terms of the experiences of the LGBT community before it was legalized. So this is where I tend to start when I redo the project. This is where we're going to start. We're going to start with this particular scene as a hook to bring the students into the lesson. And I'm gonna, I think probably because we're not transmitting live, I would like to put you on the spot and put you in the chat box to see if you could work out what this is. But maybe I'll bring Bob in and see if he knows what this is.
I'm intrigued. Yeah, it looks like some kind of living space. There's lots of it seems quite there's lots of fabric draped everywhere.
Hmm.
It looks almost, I don't know whether to use the word bohemian in this context, but
That's probably quite appropriate. Yep.
yeah. And it looks like there's some sort of social activities maybe going on here. There's a few tables, chairs, some drinks glasses.
Yeah,
So some kind of place where people are socializing, meeting up.
that's right. And when do you think this photo might have been taken? What
Ooh,
decade?
um, it's black and white, which may be a clue that it's perhaps the sort of well, I'm not quite sure when color photography came in, but in terms of it being affordable, I'd say sometime in the first half of the 20th century, maybe the 1920s, 30s.
Yeah, pretty good, Bob. So in 1930, this is a place called the Caravan Club, which was in Soho. And this was a place where typically gay men in London would be able to come. And we have this photo because it was raided by the police. And there is a letter which was found underneath one of those sofas, which was written by a young man called Cyril, writing to his boyfriend Morris. And he obviously wary that if he was found in possession of this love letter, that he would be in very difficult times. So he had ripped it up and hidden it under one of the chairs. But when the police raided it, they found the letter, painstakingly put it together, and we now have the transcript, which is in the National Archives, which is where this photo comes from, which reveals to us, the challenges of the community in the 1930s or so. So I'm going to pop you off, Bob, but thank you for that very impressive attempts there. So we would start with something like this, just to kind of like hook the students in, grab their attention, get them to kind of understand some of the context around the pre-legalization period, and then kind of reflect on the police raid, why it was happening, how they would have felt, and so on. Try and kind of get an emotional response from the students who, certainly some of my students know what it's like to be dealt with by the local constabulary, let's put it that way. So there may be some connections there. So that first lesson, when I rewrite it, is going to focus very much on that pre 67 experience. And then kind of moving forward from that, we would want to start to look at some of the issues around gender identity and thinking about the way in which those traditional gender norms have been subverted and so on. And so we can bring in people like Bowie, and certainly this picture gets an interesting reaction in the classroom in terms of the way in which Bowie is challenging those gender stereotypes and the kind of fluidity that he represents in this. And of course, we contrast it with the conventional ideas around gender and male dress in particular, and expectations and so on. And pulling out from that, so we kind of will look at ways in which gender has been constructed, certainly through kind of different elements of language, toys, personality, character, and so on. And obviously kind of trying to get students to engage with the sense of gender as a social construct. And then in that lesson in particular, we would focus on the Gender Recognition Act in 2004 and kind of look at the ways in which transgender rights have kind of changed, and kind of open up some discussions around that. Then one of the next lessons that we would do focuses on some of the protest movements in the 1970s, and in particular the GLF, the Gay Liberation Front, and we share some amazing stories really about some of the work that they were doing. This is my personal favorite, which is called Operation Rupert, which was this incredibly creative way of disrupting the Festival of Light. I think it was in 1971, and they, as you can see from this kind of picture, which is not actually contemporaneous to that event, but many of them dressed as nuns going into this event, and in the middle of the event just kind of like stood up and kind of kicked off their habits and just started canning and dancing down the middle of the stage. They let off stink bombs. They had a whole load of mice somehow, which they'd smuggled in, which scattered everywhere. And there was kiss-ins being held, and it was just an incredibly creative and disruptive and obviously quite a fabulous event at that time. But we're trying to kind of get the students to understand, first of all, why there was a need for protest and the ways in which their campaigning was effective or so. And then there's a little bit more kind of description of that there in that lesson. But we also want to, in each lesson, kind of pull back to that inquiry question around how do we remember, or how do we kind of memorialize some of these events. And so we've got different kind of opportunities for students to look at a selection of material culture, and then they hashtag it. So for example, looking at the badges that were produced at the time, you can see some of the hashtags down the side. We've already mentioned kind of David Bowie and how we would kind of look at his impact. This is Peter Tatchell and Ted Brown on the left, at the first Gay Pride March in 1972 in London. And again, kind of students thinking about how that would be labeled if that was going into an archive. And then things like gay news, and in particular, there's a picture there of Tom Robinson, and one of the people that we talked to in the lessons remembers very clearly the way in which Tom Robinson's records, which were being produced at that time, were incredibly important for young gay men in particular at that time, because they had etched into the 7-inch the telephone number of the gay switchboard, which many of them were able to access at the time. So those are the kind of things that we might do in the lesson. I'm just going to jump through a few of the other things. Unfortunately, I don't have time to show you Amy's video, but what we've done throughout this whole unit of work was we were able to ask people to create a short video presentation for us about an object or an artifact that they would include in an archive if they were going to produce an LGBT archive themselves. And here Amy talks about Michael Dillon, who underwent the first gender reassignment surgery, a phalloplasty, in the 1940s, who then went on to become a surgeon to complete the first gender reassignment surgery of male to female transgender person. So it's an incredibly kind of seminal character in trans history, and so that's why Amy chose to focus on that. So I'm going to see if I can just kind of skip just to the final bit, just kind of give you a sense of the tasks that they were focusing on. Again, they had a lot of freedom and autonomy in this project to choose whichever resources they wanted. They just had to choose 5 objects to put into their archive and then hashtag them and then justify the choices that they made. And this is, I think, where we'll end this, my section, because I think what you can see here is the power of this material in the classroom. And in this case, one of the students who felt empowered enough to share within the class the fact that she was talking, she found herself represented within the lessons, possibly for the first time in her school career. And for me, that was a really significant and important moment. Understanding that the way these histories can touch so many people's lives within and without the community. So it was a really amazing kind of experience for all of us on that. So I think that's a lovely way to wrap my section up. We've slightly just run over time. I'm just going to put up my Twitter page or my Twitter handle, which is at Dan Linden. I've got my personal email there because I think I must have put in my old slides actually because I had updated that. And you can get in touch with me again through the SHP website as well. So I'm going to just bring Bob on just for the final part of today, just to thank him very, very much for the work that he has done and the way he's shared that with us for today. So thank you, Bob.
It's been a pleasure, Dan. Thanks very much. And that was a really powerful anecdote you shared at the end about the impact that this work has on one of your students, and that's really great to hear. I also love the fact that in the resources that you've developed, that you are encouraging the students to imagine themselves into the role of an activist participating in Operation Rupert. I think that's a really interesting teaching strategy. So I've learned something from this myself.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you so much, Bob. It's been really great, and obviously, like we're gonna, you and I will certainly carry on these conversations, and we'll start planning kind of future collaborations between SHP and UCL and all of the work that you're doing. And can I just wrap up with everyone by just inviting you to join us at the Schools History Project Summer Conference, which is taking place at the end of June, 29th to 30th. in Leeds. Claire Hollis, who we've mentioned already, is going to be talking about the work that she's been doing at A-level, which was one of the questions earlier today, where she's integrated LGBT history into her A-level curriculum. And another colleague, Rebecca Carter, who was one of the writers on the Fight for Rights book, which came out from OUP history earlier in the year, with chapters around LGBT history that myself and Rebecca wrote. We'll also be sharing how she's integrated these histories into her Key Stage 3 curriculum. So lots of really amazing stuff going on there. So please come and join us. Thank you again, Bob. It's been great to work with you tonight. And good
Thanks,
night,
Dan.
everyone. Cheers.